Say it again. Educated. Mr. Halverson's voice cracked through the auditorium like a whip. The microphone felt heavier in my hands. Every head turned toward me, curiosity and confusion settling into an uneasy silence. "Excuse me?" I managed, though my throat was already tight. "You heard me," he said, leaning forward in his seat, his smile curling in a way that wasn't kind. "If you're going to speak here, at least sound educated." A pulse of heat climbed up my neck. My mind scrambled. Was it my pronunciation, my accent, or was it simply the fact that I was me, standing on this stage, my skin announcing my story before my words ever could? A few people chuckled quietly, as though his cruelty was entertainment. My chest tightened, but the thought of backing down only made the air heavier. "Right," I said, forcing my voice to steady. "As I was saying—" But the words felt strange now, their meaning tangled in the insult still hanging in the air. Somewhere in the crowd, I caught a glimpse of a woman sitting perfectly still, her gaze locked on me, not in mockery, but in something sharper. My palms itched against the mic. I knew every second I hesitated gave them more power. So I spoke again, even though the taste of the moment stayed bitter in my mouth. Each sentence left my lips like a confession I never agreed to give. My speech was supposed to be about leadership and community change, about how we could break the cycle of racial inequality in schools. But now it felt like I was on trial for existing the way I did. I could see him in the corner of my eye, arms folded, a smug tilt to his head, as though daring me to slip up again. Every time my southern vowels softened into their natural rhythm, I felt the weight of his earlier words. "Sound educated," they repeated in my mind, stripping my language of comfort and replacing it with doubt. I swallowed hard, pushing out my next point with precision, even though the passion behind it faltered. The audience wasn't leaning forward in inspiration. They were leaning forward in curiosity, waiting for me to crack. But I didn't. Not yet. From somewhere near the back, a muffled snicker escaped. Then another. I didn't have to look to know it wasn't shared in kindness. A rustle of whispers followed, each one pulling at my focus like hooks in fabric. I pushed through my next line, my tone firm, but my stomach nodding. Every laugh was a reminder this wasn't just about my speech anymore. This was about who was allowed to stand here and be heard. Through the blur of shifting faces, I found her again, the woman with the stillness that cut through the noise. She didn't frown, didn't smile. Her expression carried a weight I couldn't name. It wasn't pity. It wasn't funny. If anything, it was recognition. Her eyes stayed on me as though she was measuring something invisible. My resolve, maybe, or my willingness to finish despite the cracks forming in the moment. She didn't blink when the snickers came again. She didn't turn away when my voice wavered. And for reasons I didn't understand, that steadiness was the only thing that kept my knees from giving out. My fingers tightened against the mic until my knuckles burned. The room had no sound now except my words and the relentless tick in my head. I knew I had two choices: let the moment define me, or define it myself. So I kept speaking. One sentence, then another. Each one landed heavier than the last, not because of the topic, but because I was fighting gravity with every breath. The soft glow of phone screens lit the first few rows. Some aimed their cameras at me as if I were a spectacle, not a person. I could almost hear the captions they'd write later. "Watch this." Somewhere in that digital glare, my story was being stolen before I even finished telling it. I ended my final line with a breath I didn't realize I was holding. As I lowered the mic, my gaze found hers again, the woman who never looked away. For a split second, her eyes softened. A memory stirred, though I couldn't place it.
But before I could search for more, the applause began. Not loud, but enough to fill the space between us. And in that sound, I realized this wasn't the end. It was the start of something neither of us had named yet.
No, that's not fair, and you know it. Amara's voice, even at 12, carried a conviction that made adults pause. She had been the one to stand in front of the principal's desk, arguing for her friend's right to wear her natural hair without penalty. It wasn't just about rules, it was about dignity. Her passion for justice didn't appear overnight. It grew from moments when silence felt like betrayal. She learned early that words could cut through ignorance if wielded with precision. People listened when she spoke, not because she was the loudest, but because she was unshakable. Friends called her fearless. Her mother called her stubborn with purpose. Amara simply saw herself as someone who couldn't let wrongs pass without challenge. Long before she'd ever step onto a competition stage, she knew her voice wasn't just a gift, it was a weapon, and she intended to use it. Her world revolved around a small, two-bedroom apartment with peeling paint, but a warmth no mansion could match. Every morning, the scent of coffee mingled with her mother's favorite phrase, "Your voice is your weapon, Amara. Use it wisely." It wasn't just advice, it was a creed. Her mother, a woman who'd fought her own quiet battles against discrimination, made sure Amara understood the power of speaking up. They didn't have much, but what they had was solid: love, resilience, and a belief that silence in the face of injustice was the greatest defeat. Those words would follow Amara everywhere. At Jefferson High, Amara was a rare face in the sea of pale ones. She wasn't just the only black girl in her advanced classes, she was often the only one in the room who dared to challenge certain narratives. When history lessons skirted around uncomfortable truths, her hand went up. When group projects turned into subtle exclusion, she pushed her way in. Some admired her confidence, others saw it as arrogance. Her intellect made her stand out, but it was her unapologetic presence that made her unforgettable. Being a minority in the majority meant constantly navigating between pride and exhaustion. And though she never showed it, the weight of being the example was heavier than anyone guessed. "You speak so well," a teacher once told her after a debate. It was meant as praise, but the pause before it and the faint surprise in the tone twisted it into something else. It wasn't the first time. Compliments that felt more like backhanded reminders of what people expected from someone like her. She learned to smile politely, but inside, each one added another layer to her armor. Because she knew, these weren't just words. They were reflections of a world still steeped in quiet prejudice. Amara wanted more than survival. She wanted to win. The statewide speech competition wasn't just a goal, it was a stepping stone. Winning meant scholarship money, recognition, a chance to stand on a stage where her words could reach beyond the school's walls. She imagined her name announced, the applause washing over her like proof that all the battles, big and small, had been worth it. But wanting something that badly also meant one thing: she had everything to lose if she failed. It was the mispronounced Amara that became Amy without permission, the lunch lady who assumed she needed a free meal form, the shocked faces when she aced exams. Individually, they were annoyances. Together, they were constant reminders that she didn't quite belong in the spaces she'd earned her way into. She wore those moments like invisible armor, each one strengthening her resolve to prove, over and over, that she had every right to be there.
"Amara, welcome," Mr. Halverson had said the first time they met, voice warm enough to sound genuine. He shook her hand firmly, smiling like someone who believed in every student's potential. At first glance, nothing seemed off. He laughed easily, cracked jokes with the team, even told her she had a strong presence that would impress the judges. But as practices continued, a faint edge crept into his words. Compliments came with qualifiers, as though her successes were somehow unexpected. "You've got a natural way of speaking," he'd say, then glance at another student and add, "especially for someone so new to this environment." She caught the pauses, the loaded emphasis. They weren't outright insults, but subtle reminders of where he thought she belonged and where he didn't. And while others missed the shift, Amara felt it in every carefully chosen syllable. It happened during a heated discussion over speech structure. Amara defended her choice to keep a section intact, citing research and competition rules. "You're giving me a lot of sass right now," Mr. Halverson said, chuckling as if the words softened its sting. "Dial back the attitude, all right? We're just trying to help you." Her jaw tightened. The same tone from another student, especially one of the blonde, blue-eyed boys, was labeled as passionate or confident. With her, it became difficult and defensive. The room went quiet, a few eyes darting toward her before quickly looking away. Amara forced herself to nod, knowing that pushing further would only prove his point in his eyes. But inside, something shifted. This wasn't about debate strategy anymore. It was about permission to speak without being reduced to a stereotype. During the next rehearsal, she barely finished 2 lines before he cut in. "Try softening that part. Too sharp." She adjusted, only to be stopped again. "Slow down here. Now emphasize that word more. Actually, less." It became a cycle. Speak, interrupt, repeat. The feedback wasn't about content. It was about molding her into something she wasn't. Across the room, her classmates rattled off their lines without pause. Their minor stumbles were overlooked, but Amara's delivery, clear, steady, and polished, was treated like a work in need of constant repair. By the 5th interruption, her voice felt foreign in her own mouth. The rhythm she honed over weeks dissolved under the weight of his corrections, each one a reminder that no matter how well she performed, it would never be enough. It became impossible not to notice the contrast. Jacob, who barely glanced at his notes, was praised for his raw energy. Hannah, who forgot half her speech, was encouraged to keep experimenting. Amara, meanwhile, was stopped mid-sentence for a misplaced cause. "Be careful, precision matters," Halverson would say, pen tapping against his clipboard. When she tried a more conversational tone, he shook his head. "Not polished enough." When she kept it formal, he frowned. "Too stiff." It was a moving target, a standard she couldn't meet because it didn't exist for everyone. Only for her. The others floated freely, their mistakes seen as creative risks. Hers were recorded as flaws. And though she stayed silent, the double standard pressed heavier with each session, turning the classroom into a place where she was always on trial. One afternoon, Halverson leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "I think you should cut the section about racial inequality," he said casually, as though trimming a sentence about weather. Amara stared at him. "That's the heart of my speech." "Right, but it might make some people uncomfortable, and you don't want to alienate the judges, do you?" The irony burned. Her entire piece was about confronting injustice, yet he wanted it softened to protect the very comfort she was challenging. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at the floor, pressing her lips together. Removing that section would hollow her message, but refusing meant risking his disapproval. Either way, her voice was being managed, edited for acceptability rather than truth. By now, she could predict it. The interruption before she finished a point. The helpful suggestion that stripped meaning from her words. The quiet applause for others' half-formed ideas while hers were dissected until lifeless. It was more than a bad day, more than tough coaching. It was a pattern. One that didn't start or end with her. Walking home that evening, her mind replayed every exchange, connecting them like pins on a map. The moments that once left her doubting herself now revealed the design she could no longer ignore. The realization didn't bring relief, it brought focus. She wasn't imagining this. She wasn't oversensitive. And knowing that meant she had a choice: stay silent or start preparing for a fight she hadn't planned to wage.
Stop. Say it properly. Mr. Halverson's voice sliced through the auditorium, halting Amara mid-sentence. Her breath caught, the rhythm of her speech collapsing under the weight of his interruption. She tried to steady herself. No, he waved dismissively, pacing toward the front of the stage. That word, it's pronounced differently. You've got to be careful, dear. The murmurs from the audience rippled like static. She'd rehearsed that section 100 times. There was nothing wrong with her delivery. Yet here she was, standing exposed, every eye fixed on her. Amara adjusted her posture. Halverson raised his palm. We'll just repeat it until it's right. Go ahead. His tone carried a sweetness so artificial it made her skin crawl. She repeated the word, her voice firm, but quieter than before. Better, he said, though his smirk told her he wasn't finished. The audience's attention was no longer on her message. It was on her correction, as though she were a child fumbling with her first sentence. Her hands trembled, but she refused to look down. If she did, she knew she wouldn't find her way back. Without warning, Halverson tilted his head and repeated her line, but not as she'd spoken it. His voice slid into a caricatured drawl, twisting her words into a clumsy, streetwise slang she had never used. You know what I'm saying? He added, forcing a laugh that wasn't echoed by most in the room. Her stomach churned. The sharp sting of racial mockery was unmistakable, even dressed up as humor. A couple of students snickered. She recognized the sound instantly. Nervous laughter, the kind that comes from not knowing whether to be offended or amused. She kept her eyes locked on the back wall, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her reaction. Her speech was about resilience and equality. Now it felt hijacked, turned into a punchline she never wrote. Halverson glanced at her with a raised brow, as if expecting her to play along. She stayed silent. Oh, lighten up, he said, chuckling at his own imitation. We're just having a little fun. The word fun sat heavy in the air, but it wasn't hers to share. Halverson faced the audience, the corners of his mouth curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Bless her heart, he said warmly. She's trying so hard. The room's energy shifted again, this time sharper, colder. The phrase wasn't a compliment. It was a public branding, a polite way of telling everyone she was failing. A couple of adults offered sympathetic nods, their eyes filled with pity rather than respect. The same people who had been leaning forward moments ago now sat back, as though the fight had left the stage entirely. Amara's jaw clenched. She'd been raised to believe her words could carry weight, that her ideas mattered. Now the man tasked with guiding her had reduced her to a struggling novice in front of her peers, her teachers, and strangers who would leave with this single impression. Halverson gave her an encouraging nod, mock encouragement, thin as glass. Well, shall we let her continue? Her pulse thudded in her ears. Continue? There was no choice. She inhaled slowly, stepping back toward the microphone, but the atmosphere felt different, tainted. A few gasps still lingered in the air, mostly from the front rows where parents sat. Some shook their heads in quiet disapproval, while others fought to hide faint smiles. One student buried his face in his hands, as though embarrassed for her, while a cluster of others bit their lips to suppress laughter. The heat under her skin wasn't just from stage lights. It was the flush of being stripped of dignity under the guise of mentorship. Her eyes darted to the far corner, where a mother held her child's hand tighter, her gaze fixed on Halverson as though silently asking, "Was that necessary?" But the man at the center of it all seemed oblivious, basking in the control he held. A loud snicker broke through her pause. It came from the middle row, sharp, deliberate. Halverson didn't flinch, no reprimand, no disapproving glare. Instead, he let the corner of his mouth lift just slightly, a silent permission for the ridicule to continue. The message was clear. Her discomfort was entertainment. She tightened her grip on the podium. She wanted to call it out, to demand that he treat her with the same respect he gave others. But the words she'd prepared for weeks were tangled in a knot of frustration and shame. He leaned against the edge of the stage, arms folded, as though waiting to see how she'd perform under this new weight. And somewhere deep down, she knew that silence was exactly what he wanted. When she began again, her tone lacked the crisp conviction it once held. Each word felt heavier, dragging across her tongue. She stumbled over a sentence she knew by heart. A slight tremor in her voice betrayed her composure. From the corner of her vision, she caught a student whispering to another, their smirks growing. Her message, about unity, justice, and the courage to speak truth, was dissolving into background noise. The room wasn't listening to her anymore. They were watching her falter. Halverson didn't step in to encourage her. He simply waited, like a spectator watching the clock run down. In the front row, a woman Amara hadn't noticed before leaned forward. Her expression was calm, but her gaze was razor-sharp, fixed not on the stage, but on Halverson. Amara couldn't place her, parent, teacher, stranger, but there was something deliberate in the way the woman crossed her arms, as though storing every detail for later. For the first time since the interruption, Amara felt someone in the room was silently on her side. The faint click of phone cameras began to punctuate the silence. Parents, subtle but steady, lifted their devices just enough to capture in the exchange in its raw form. They didn't move much, just enough to capture the exchange in its raw form. It wasn't just her speech anymore. Something bigger was being documented. And Halverson, oblivious or uncaring, still carried himself like the untouchable authority. When she reached her final line, Halverson stepped forward, clapping with exaggerated slowness. "Well done," he said, pausing before adding, "A hand for effort." The word hung in the air, dripping with condescension. The audience complied, some clapping politely, others hesitating before joining in. The sound was fractured, awkward applause mixed with the unspoken knowledge of what had just happened. Amara forced herself to nod once in thanks, but her throat burned. Effort, as though all she had given was a try, not a truth worth hearing. She walked off stage, head lowered, her steps unsteady. In the wings, the tears came faster than she could stop them, blurring her vision. Somewhere out front, the woman in the first row remained still, her eyes locked on the stage, as though this was far from over.
"I can't go back out there," Amara whispered, her voice trembling as the muffled applause from the auditorium bled through the curtains. She pressed her back against the wall, clutching her hands together so tightly her nails bit into her skin. Every laugh, every cruel glance replayed in her mind like a broken record. Her chest tightened as footsteps passed nearby, the echo amplifying her desire to disappear. She swiped at her cheeks, willing the tears to vanish before anyone saw her like this. The low hum of voices from the audience felt distant, yet heavy, like a weight pressing her further into the shadows. She wanted silence, just a moment to breathe, but the noise carried on, a reminder that the humiliation hadn't ended. Somewhere out there, the man who had cut her down still stood proud. Amara. The single word froze her in place. Slowly, she turned toward the voice. The tall, composed woman stepped into the dim backstage light, her presence filling the narrow space without effort. For a heartbeat, Amara forgot to breathe. Then recognition struck. "Mom?" she murmured. Viola Davis's gaze softened, though the steel in her posture remained. "I was in the crowd." She moved closer, the faint scent of her perfume blending with the backstage air. Amara's throat tightened again, but this time it wasn't from shame, it was from disbelief. She hadn't expected her mother to be here, not today. Viola reached out, placing a firm hand on her daughter's shoulder, grounding her in the middle of her storm. "You didn't fail," Viola said, her voice low but charged with certainty. "You stood on that stage and you made them listen. That takes strength." Amara shook her head, her lips trembling. "He made me sound like a joke." "Let him," Viola replied, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "Because now they've heard you, and they've seen what they tried to break." The words sank in, heavy yet comforting. For the first time since stepping off stage, Amara felt her breathing steady. "You came here for me?" she asked. "I came here," Viola said, tightening her grip, "to remind my daughter she was born to stand in the light, not hide in the shadows." The low rumble of murmurs began seeping backstage. It started with a few voices, hesitant and questioning, but grew steadily as the recognition spread. "That's Viola Davis," someone whispered. "Is that her daughter?" another voice asked. The name carried through the assembly like sparks in dry grass. The restless energy in the room shifted, curiosity replacing the earlier smugness. Amara could hear it all, the way her mother's presence had rippled through the audience. Behind the curtain, teachers exchanged glances, unsure whether to continue the program or let the moment play out. And in that indecision, the balance of control began to tilt. By the time Mr. Halverson stepped off the stage, he was met by a wall of parents, their faces sharp with disapproval. "What exactly was supposed to be?" one father demanded. "You humiliated a child," another said, her voice a low, cutting whisper. Halverson attempted a smile, hands raised, as if to deflect their frustration. "You're misunderstanding." "No," the woman interrupted, "we understood perfectly." Their words weren't loud, but the edge in them was unmistakable. Halverson's posture stiffened, his once relaxed stance now taut. His smirk, the one he had worn so comfortably earlier, had vanished. The authority he had clung to all morning felt suddenly fragile. Every camera pointed in his direction made his throat tighten. He cleared his throat as if to interrupt, but the sound was swallowed by the room's focus on Viola. For the first time, he wasn't the center of attention. And as her words continued to flow, the realization hit him. Control was no longer his to claim.
Have you seen this? It's everywhere. Text messages pinged across the country as Viola's speech lit up feeds overnight. Twitter threads dissected every word, Instagram Reels replayed her unwavering stance, and TikTok edits paired her voice with captions about racial justice in schools. Hashtags like Protect Black Voices and School Bias Exposed trended into the morning. Comment sections filled with educators, parents, and students, some shocked, others vindicated. Amara scrolled through the tidal wave of support, her heart racing, not from fear this time, but from the unmistakable shift in the air. For the first time, it wasn't just her fight anymore. She whispered to herself, almost in disbelief, "They're listening." Yet deep down, she knew the storm had only just begun to gather force. By midday, the district's official account posted a statement. "We take these allegations seriously. A full investigation is underway." It sounded cautious, but the undertone was unmistakable. This was damage control. A formal inquiry into Mr. Halverson's actions, both recent and past, was launched. Amara overheard teachers in hushed conversations, their voices tight with unease. Her phone kept buzzing, but she ignored most messages. She wasn't celebrating yet. She'd learned enough to know that in cases like this, institutions moved slowly, often hoping the noise would fade. This time, she hoped the noise would roar instead. It didn't take long. By evening, alumni flooded social media with their own accounts, stories of condescension, dismissals, and sudden grading mistakes that always seemed to affect students of color. One post read, "I thought it was just me. Guess not." Others shared emails they once ignored out of fear. Amara read each one with a mix of relief and heartbreak. This wasn't new. It was a pattern. And now the truth was finally echoing through channels no one could shut down or ignore. 2 days later, the headline spread, "Local educator placed on administrative leave amid bias allegations." The words felt heavy in Amara's hands as she read the news. Mr. Halverson's name was stripped from the competition announcements. His smirk, the one she'd grown used to, was gone from her life. At least for now. There was no official verdict yet, but power had shifted. She didn't feel vindictive, only certain. Certain that silence had cost too much for too long, and someone had finally paid the price. Email after email poured in, youth organizations, community centers, and even colleges inviting Amara to speak. They wrote, "We want you to share your story." She hesitated at first, unsure if she was ready to carry that weight. Viola reminded her, "Your voice isn't just for you anymore." So she accepted. She spoke about resilience, about calling out injustice even when your voice shakes. Each time, the applause felt less like praise and more like a collective agreement that this fight was worth waging. Her words were no longer just hers. They belonged to something larger. Weeks later, Amara stepped onto the state competition stage, her speech polished, her confidence unshaken. When the winner was announced, her name carried across the room like a promise fulfilled. The applause was thunderous, not just for eloquence, but for courage. She saw tears in the crowd and knew this victory wasn't measured in trophies. It was a message. Her story had traveled further than she ever imagined. Months later, she stood under brighter lights at a grander event before a crowd even larger than the state finals. Her delivery was flawless, each word grounded in lived truth. From the first syllable, the audience was silent, leaning in. Viola sat near the front, her hands clasped, her pride radiating like a quiet fire. Amara didn't glance away this time. She owned every second, every breath she spoke. The final sentence rolled off her tongue without hesitation. This time, she said, her gaze sweeping across the crowd, "My voice didn't shake." The room erupted into applause so loud it seemed to carry through walls. And in that moment, she knew the echo would not fade anytime soon. Have you ever watched someone be humiliated because of the color of their skin? The narrator asks, the words cutting through the air. In that instant, what would you have done? Would you have stayed silent or stepped forward? Share your truth in the comments. Every story matters. Yours could be the one that gives someone else the courage to stand up. Together, we make silence impossible. Like, subscribe, and share this video. Let's turn one act of courage into a movement. Someone out there needs to hear this message. Be the reason they do.